Hello and welcome to the RAIC Corporate Affiliate Series. Our corporate affiliate for today's webinar is Velux. For over 75 years, the Velux Group is the world leader in the manufacturing of residential skylights and is one of the strongest international brands in the building materials sector. With over 300 patents in skylight design, Velux is known for product innovation, quality, and durability. For over a decade, Velux Canada has been ramping up its commercial product line to serve the Canadian market better. Our commercial program includes the Commercial Sun Tunnel, Tubular Skylight, the revolutionary Dynamic and Energy Dome Skylights, and more recently, the Velux Modular Skylight VMS, a prefabricated modular skylight designed in collaboration with Foster & Partners. Velux continues to lead the residential industry with the no-leak skylight, sun tunnel skylights, roof windows, as well as a range of blinds, installation solutions, and intelligent home controls. Whether your project is residential or commercial, offer your customers the innovation and quality they deserve at an affordable price. For more information, visit velux.ca/professionals. Today's presentation is titled Residential Skylight Trends Going into 2022, presented by Russell Ibbotson.
The summary for today's webinar is that we're going to be looking at trends around the use of skylights in residential applications. There's a lot that's been happening in recent years that are influencing the direction and how we work with skylights in residential projects. In this presentation, we're going to do our best to capture that and to show the trends that have been emerging and give some indication of where we think these trends are going. Learning objectives today is to recognize the benefits of skylight renovations. We're going to look at a lot of case studies, projects mostly in Canada, and be able to talk about those. We're going to look at the learning objective of how to summarize ongoing improvements on skylight performance. This is going to come up as a bit of a theme that's influencing some of the trends. We're also going to come away knowing how to determine which skylight designs would work for different kinds of roofs or different types of ceilings, different considerations that can factor into there on the design. And finally, identifying how automation can help optimize some of the experience around daylight and fresh air through the roof. My name is Russell Ibbotson. I am your presenter today. I have 20 years of experience in the building materials industry, and I started off in the renewable industry, and then I switched into fenestration. And about 11 years ago, I switched to, I joined Velux. And at Velux, I've been working with architects and builders and engineers for over a decade now, looking at how to design with skylights, but with a particular interest in the energy side and the sustainability side, and with a growing interest in kind of the design and health benefits around that. So I work for Velux. Velux is an international company. Head office is in Denmark. And we've just celebrated 45 years in Canada, 80 years internationally. So we're well established in the industry here. And without going too far into all the cool things or what I think is really cool that the company does, I did want to just highlight one of the things that is relevant to what's happening right now. A year ago, we launched It's Our Nature. This was our sustainability strategy for 2030. And I just want to draw a couple of key highlights out of this. One of the highlights for me, and we're going through some product redesign right now, we're working towards having a 50% reduction of the carbon footprint of our products. And this is huge because 94% of the carbon in the production of our skylights actually comes from our suppliers. So to hit a 50% target, we're going to have to team up with our glass, aluminum, and plastic suppliers to bring that embodied carbon of our product down. We're also working by 2030, we're going to be carbon neutral in our operations. And even better than that, by our 100th anniversary in 2041, we will be historically carbon neutral. So back from 100 years of putting carbon into our climate and our atmosphere, we're going to work with the WWF and other groups to recapture all of our historical carbon. And all this is being done with scientific-based calculations, assumptions, and it's all going to be shared to the industry. So we're really hoping that other building industry companies will step forward and they'll see what we're doing, they'll be inspired and say, we can do this too. And perhaps they'll even leapfrog us, and then we can say, wow, they're doing something else that's really great. Let's do that. And we can start a little bit of a snowball effect in the industry, all working towards more sustainable products, more sustainable buildings, and reducing our carbon footprint. So for today's webinar, I'm doing something a little bit different. I've never done a trends discussion. We certainly talk a lot about it on our project team. We pick up on trends that we're seeing in projects as we're supporting projects across Canada, and we're watching what's happening in the US as well as Europe. And this presentation really is to try to capture some of that conversation and share it with you. So I really picked 5 key themes to talk about, but I want to start with some of the influences. What's influencing these trends that we're pulling out for discussion today? Well, it seems appropriate to talk about the influence of the pandemic, especially with residential applications, because the pandemic saw us spending a lot more time at home. Many of us were lucky enough to keep our jobs, and we're lucky enough that we're able to safely work at home. I have 4 children. This is not a scene that's foreign to me. There were times where we were doing the homeschooling and my wife had to take a meeting in our office, and then we would trade off, and I would work at the kitchen table, she would work at the kitchen table. So we saw this multitasking of space, and that had a big influence on how we started to think about the use of space and a few other things. One of them was that connection to the outdoors. Now, I'm lucky enough that we do have some nice views from our small house. We have our offices in the attic where we've actually got skylights that can look out onto some trees and some nice skyline. But we saw an increased interest in that connection. As people were shut in more, they were looking for the views out much more. And that came up a lot in our discussions. There's a lot of discussion about indoor environment. And this is something I've been really interested in for a number of years. And this image is from a CBC discussion on HEPA filters, but air quality and looking at all these different influencers on our indoor environment became much more front of mind as connections started to be made towards the pandemic, and also the understanding of our comfort and our health and how this could all play into that. We also saw some increased savings. Those of us that were not traveling to work, many of us weren't able to take vacations or do other things. So many Canadians in general saw an increase in their savings. And the question then becomes, well, where did some of that money go? Well, some people decided that it was time to move. And we saw a big migration of people moving out of the city into small towns. I happen to live in a small town outside of Hamilton in Ontario. And we certainly saw a lot of folks moving in from Toronto and other places to our small community. And moving in, they often sold their properties for much higher, and they were in a position where they could do some renovations. Or in my situation, we already lived here, and we were considering some renovations, and we actually postponed them because of material prices and labor accessibility. But we have plans with an architect. We're ready to do a pretty serious renovation, like many Canadians were. So there was a lot of mentality of if we're gonna spend this time from home at home, let's think about how to make home better. And we had a lot of people being influenced by learning more about design, and whether they're watching television programs, reading magazines. We saw people sharing their Pinterest accounts with us, and really just trying to show us where they're getting their inspiration, and reading up on some of the design parts of it. And this wasn't always architects, although sometimes architects would bring images to us. Certainly, James Terrell comes up quite often in our design meetings when we're supporting architects on projects. We saw the image earlier. So we saw a lot more interest in design around skylights than we historically had. And then climate change. I show this map of our temperature range historically, and then this prediction infographic is talking about the severity of where our weather could be going. And if we're going to be experiencing more hot days, more heavy rainfalls, more extended heat waves, how is that going to influence our design decisions, our residential renovations and upgrades that we're looking at? How are people thinking about that? And there's two sides. When I often think about it, I'm like, well, I have an older house. How can I make sure this house continues to be comfortable? I don't want my house to be overheating in the summer and freezing cold in the wintertime. So how can I make changes? And whether that's my building envelope, including my windows, or making it more airtight, start to think about these changes. And then, of course, carbon. We're talking a lot more about carbon footprints, and we're looking at our buildings as being major contributors to our carbon, both in operation and when they're being built, the embodied carbon. So figuring out with the changes to the environment, how can we be doing some of the stuff, the design and construction we're doing, how can we do that better? That became an influence on some of the discussions we're having. And as somebody who kind of, I guess I self-label as somebody who's an environmentalist, I was impressed at how many more people were taking an interest in this side of things. So the bottom line with influences is that sometimes they're hard to balance. You want to do something that is considerate of the climate, and you want to do something that's going to increase the comfort of your space. And then also trying to figure out, well, how do I make this design interesting? I want that wow factor. I want to do something that is going to be interesting, and I could brag about and maybe put an image of it on social media. That kind of thing is influencing the decisions around skylights. So with that, I'd like to jump in and talk about some of the trends that we're seeing emerge around the use of skylights in residential applications. So the first one is go big. We saw a lot of interest in these larger skylight applications. And I really like to think of that as, people want in our climate in different parts of Canada, we end up spending a fair bit of time indoors. And I know the number that gets thrown around a lot is that we spend 90% of our time indoors as the indoor generation. And so when you have the opportunity to have larger windows or skylights to connect to the outdoors, but still have that comfort of your indoor climate, there's a lot of interest in that, more so than we have historically seen. We've seen it in more typologies of buildings. More small projects. This has always been something that we've been involved with, but there's been an increased interest in design and use of skylights in the smaller spaces, the washrooms, the stairwells, the hallways, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. Also seeing an interest in expansion, expanding the home, and as some of the prices of properties went up, we saw an increase in renovation. And part of that was because people didn't have move up options in their neighborhood or move down options in their neighborhood, and they didn't want to move far away to change the house type that they had. So we saw a lot of renovations, particularly adding space, which isn't always an extension, but so we'll talk about a little bit of repurposing space and different applications where we saw skylights being used in. And then upgrades. We saw partially environmentally influenced, partially comfort influenced, and partially because they finally, customers had the time and money to do it. We saw a lot of upgrades of existing product happen this past year, and we see that as a trend that's going to continue. And finally, this idea of get smart. And I really tried to take a look at this part of it from two perspectives. One, the building automation, the smartphone sort of element, but also some smart design. And that's the one I think becomes actually more interesting. So we've got some examples of how we've seen the interest of that side of things come into play. So let's keep moving forward and start off with going big. So what I've done is tried to capture a number of different projects, and then I want to talk about these different case studies across Canada. So this is a project in British Columbia. The opening of this project, I think, it's 12 feet by 5 feet. It's a large skylight using our modular skylight system. But this skylight is doing a couple of things. It's facing the north, so it's going to have north skylight, so not a lot of direct light, but more diffuse light. It's also positioned at the back of a space. And I don't have an image of the lake-facing part of this house, but you can imagine there's going to be a lot of glass because that's a spectacular view out of the house. So the skylights are also acting as a balance of the light. They're bringing backlighting in to help balance the light in that space with daylight. So it's a really smart use, but it's a big skylight. This isn't one of our typical unit skylights that might be 2 feet by 4 feet sort of thing. So there's a picture of the interior finish, just from 2 different angles. So this is a project that is using unit skylights in that approximate size of 2 feet by 4 feet, but they've used a whole bunch of them. And they've used a combination system on the sloped roof to couple, and what we got 16 skylights on this extension. So this is an addition to the back of a home. This is in Calgary. You can see it's actually elevated and it's coming out the back. And this is a sunroom in the truest sense. You've got glass all the way around, but it's also thermally efficient glass. So you've got your low E coatings, which are going to help with your solar heat gain. And you've got operable skylights. So you've got blinds that can close to help reduce the solar heat gain in this space. So you can reduce the greenhouse effect of overheating that space or help control it. Both with the low E coatings as well as with the blinds. They also have a couple of units that vent. And Calgary has a very moderate summer climate. So venting is often very usable for the warmer periods of the year because they don't typically have to deal with the elevated humidity that we have in some other parts of Canada in the summertime. So they're able to get some nice natural ventilation through the space. So it's a good example of using lots of small skylights. Same area, same contractor. You can see you can go quite big with unit skylights, and the system to flash them all together, it works. And I'll point out here because it actually comes up in a couple of projects. They're using the skylights as a separation in a way because you have 2 spaces. You've got you're over top of the stairs. You're bringing light into the front landing, and there's a kitchen area, as well as the upstairs transit space. And you're also creating this division within the building with this daylit corridor. So with this system, all the skylights are framed individually, and then they're installed. You have to drywall around them. So that system is available as an option. And I would say this is the lower cost option to go big with skylights. And this is one out on in BC again. Now, the other option is looking at our modular system. And you can see in this application, they've done, the skylights look small on the roof, but you can see the scale of the inside opening. These are our larger skylights. Just checking, I have an interior finish photo. You can see how they've brought those skylights in. You're extending the view. You see through the vertical windows, you can see the neighbors' houses, and you can see the trunks of trees. But bringing the skylights in here, and I love this, and this is one of my favorite parts about having skylights in my own home, is you get to see the treetops from inside the house. And it's so rare. And I live in an older neighborhood where the houses are fairly close, and I have an apartment building across the road. It's rare that I have a nice sky view or treetop view from my vertical windows. So the skylights placed like this can bring that nature in. Thinking back to what the influencers are and really connecting. And a product like this, you can go triple pane, you can go blinds, so you can really control or optimize the energy side of things. And what's important, like vertical windows, when you go bigger with skylights, more energy efficient is better. So there's two sides of this. It's your solar heat gain, so a reduced solar heat gain if you're not, unless you're facing north at a reasonable angle, more than 45 degrees, or your U value is the other part of it. So your U value being your thermal efficiency. The lower the U value, the better. It's inverse of R value. So the lower your U value, lower U value becomes more important when you have a large skylight opening, because you want to control the comfort, or you want to have less influence on the thermal comfort of that space. Let's go to the East Coast, because I haven't included enough from the East yet. This is a project in Halifax, and this was just outside of the Citadel Park, block, I think, south of it. And they wanted to create, this was both an upgrade and an expansion of the Skylight system. And we see these longer units, townhouses and some front to back condos. I used to live in Montreal where that was very common, where you've got this nice light at the two ends of the space, but being on the top floor, you have that option to bring more light into the core of the space, which I think is pretty special. And they went a bit bigger on this project, and they did put blinds and venting and triple pane. So they really thought about the energy efficiency, thought about the design of it. And I don't have final pictures of this project, but it created a really nice look. These are projects, a couple of projects that were part of the Active House program that Velux is involved with, and they're all Canadian. So the first project was down in Niagara Falls, and the architect placed a lot of skylights, both to capture the sky view, but also to leverage the reflected light. And these are larger skylights because they're being grouped together, but the effect that it creates is pretty impressive. And the two pictures on the right are in Etobicoke, which is part of Toronto, a second project with the same design team, where they were able to create quite a connection to the outdoors, in part with the use of the skylights, creating these larger openings, but also well placed to curate that light coming in. So another project, this one is on Bowen Island, and this project had two skylight openings on it. The larger one is, again, this was a skylight that's splitting the private and public space of the house. And this skylight is about 45 feet long. So it's a pretty long skylight. And I've got some interior pictures of during construction and final. And these are just taken on a phone, but you can see it's quite a large skylight. But again, triple pane, blinds. On the design side, you can see at the top and the bottom, the finished wall has been inset. So you lose the view of the frame and the blinds at the top and the bottom of the skylight, but it creates a nice look. You also have the skylights aligning with the vertical wall on the right, if you look in the center picture, which is going to bring the light down nice and evenly on the wall without a ledge. You won't get a shadow at the top of the wall. So some really nice considerations with how this skylight was placed in the space, and it's big. These photos come from our marketing catalog, but just to give you an idea of what you can do with a kitchen when you have access to the roof. I have to say, in my opinion, the kitchen is my favorite place to put skylights. In my last house, I took the ceiling out and put skylights in, and I loved it. And when I moved into this house, I have a bedroom above my kitchen, and it's one of the things that I really miss about my old space. Having that connection from the kitchen was really special. So I think kitchens will always be somewhere where it'd be nice to go big with the skylights. All right, let's go from big to small and take a look at some small projects. This might be my favorite washroom, bathroom project. This is in Toronto. It's been in a couple of magazines, but they're doing some really interesting things here. And I'm going to talk about the use of the mirror later on as well. But you'll also notice that the entire perimeter of the skylight, it appears to be frameless. And earlier I used an image from James Turrell where he's able to capture that frameless, it's often an oculus without glass in it, in his projects, but he's able to capture that and really frame the sky in the most interesting way. And I think this is one of the projects that does such a good job of that. And I can't look at these pictures without pointing out the fact that the tree that you see in the mirror, you have to remember you're looking in a mirror. So that tree is actually behind you in the house. And so the physical tree, you're seeing the reflection of it. So this idea of using mirrors to extend the sky and to amplify the daylight that's coming in is really well represented in this project. And it truly is one of my favorite images and for residential use of skylights. So you can see you can use skylights and place them in these small spaces. And the use of daylight and the use of skylights and pushing out the ceiling makes these spaces feel larger. And that's one of the themes that skylights can bring in, is that you can raise the ceiling, and bringing daylight in even makes a small space feel bigger. So skylights offer a real nice opportunity for small spaces. And I would say often we saw small spaces historically using a very minimal skylight. The trend has definitely been to increase the size of that skylight. We've seen a lot more interest in putting skylights over tubs and showers. And this is something that, that idea to be able to look up while you're showering and see the sky, it's quite charming. And this is where the energy efficiency improvements on skylights are going to help with that, because historically a less energy efficient skylight would get condensation on it very quickly. And even the energy efficient ones might, if you're having a very hot shower or it's very cold outside, but the more energy efficient the skylight, the less condensation you're going to have. So you'd be able to have that beautiful connection to the outdoors. So this is another project in Toronto that's looking at a stairwell. And I think my favorite quote from Instagram came from a post of the picture on the right, where the architect said, "Light well meets stairwell." I thought that was cute, and was enough inspiration to click through and try to find some more images of this project, because they've done a nice job of framing the skylights, bringing the daylight down the stairs, which also means it's being brought into both the upper floor and the lower floor around the staircase. But it also creates something interesting when you're walking up the stairs. And I both sets of stairs in my little house have skylights above them. And I find looking through the roof at the sky, connecting with the weather outside and what the sky is doing becomes really interesting. And it makes moving around the house more interesting. You can also do this on flat roofs. So often we focus on sloped roofs, and our company and other skylight companies, that's what historically, especially with the European companies, historically has been our focus, because we've been converting attic spaces into living space with sloped roofs. But we have an immense amount of flat roof residential buildings, and with the rise of the influence of modern design with flat roofs, we're seeing it in more new production homes as well. So there are products that are very energy efficient and well designed that can be installed on that application as well. And just to round off the small spaces with the stairs again, stairs offer this great opportunity to bring light in. And you'll see the second image is actually a tubular skylight. I haven't spent enough time on what we call a sun tunnel, but the building code calls a tubular daylighting device, a TDD. I'm an engineer, but I'm going to say that must have been an engineer that came up with that name officially in the code. But there's a lot of interesting things you can do in these spaces. The picture on the right was a project in Toronto that took place last year. And I just wanted to point out one, well, maybe two elements of it. One, the skylights coming close to that vertical wall, bringing the light down the wall, giving you that reflected indirect light coming off of the wall, really brightens the space. And also, if you look at the end of the light shaft towards the vertical window, the architect team chose to round off that transition to the ceiling. And by rounding that off, you reduce the contrast between that horizontal ceiling and the skylight. Often what we see is that the ceiling ends up looking dark beside the light shaft of a skylight, because there's a contrast there. Even if it's white and there's light reflecting on it, it can appear to be dark. So flaring the light shaft out or having that round transition can help soften the light transition across the ceiling and give you the perception that there's less contrast in the space. This is a project in British Columbia where they've spread some skylights out, but they have this wonderful little play space that they've carved out of this attic. And I saw this and I thought of my kids and how much they like these cozy sort of spaces. And they've positioned that skylight up against the wall, so it's reflecting light into the space. It's really interesting, and there's a theme that I'll bring back later. Is that they have this little window. If you look on the right-hand picture, you can see one of the children looking down out of this little window. So it's connecting it to the house. And if they didn't have skylights in the larger space, you'd be able to bleed some light through, borrow some light from that space. Again, a concept we'll come back to in a little bit. All right, let's look at the trend number 3 that we're seeing a lot more interest in going into 2022. Let's look at expand. So this is a project in Germany, and this is an extension of the home. And this is similar to the project that I postponed on my own home, where this looking to create this well-connected sunroom that's still part of the main home. So using skylights and vertical windows to maximize the connection to the outdoors. And again, you've got to, if you're working with a project like this, for it to be comfortable when it's very cold or very sunny out in the summertime, you've got to make sure you've got energy efficient products on there. You got to factor that in, because otherwise you're going to be too hot in the summer and too cold in the wintertime. And this is a space you'd want to be able to spend as much time as possible in. So the other thing to think about when you expand with an extension, you're cutting off the vertical windows of the existing space. You're in essence pushing out your windows further out into your backyard or side yard, pulling the daylight away from the space that was once there. One way to balance that off is by adding skylights. So not only do you get that beautiful connection, this large amount of daylight that comes into the new space, you're also bringing daylight into the existing space that had been cut off from the windows. So it is really a nice way to make sure that you're not orphaning the daylight from that existing space. Now, this is a project that kind of captures that. This is in Montreal, close to a neighborhood that I used to live in, just west of downtown. And this is a project where they put on a 2-story rear extension, and they were using these skylights to bring light into that space, but it's also bringing light into the previous room. There's the room that's getting cut off. Now here's a project in Toronto from a few years ago, but it's one that we've referenced a lot because it does something interesting. This was a project where they rebuilt on the same site, but they wanted to maximize the width of the house. So they did what's called a 0 lot line. And when you do a 0 lot line, you can't do windows on the side, or you've got setbacks for windows unless they're fire rated. But you can use skylights if they're less than 60 degrees. So on this project, they moved a lot of the fenestration onto the roof and created this top lighting scenario because they had to remove most of the windows from the sides of the house. So you can see the stairs. I love the skylights over the stairs. I keep pointing out pictures of this because it's beautiful and it's multifunctional. They also created this opening. And I know I did something similar, not to this, not as large as this, in my own house, where in this case, they're bringing light through the second floor. So if you look at the walkway on the right-hand image, you see that day-lit space and a second railing kind of as you're walking towards the room at the back of the photo. That is an opening that goes from the roof to the ground floor. So they've sacrificed the floor area on the second floor in order to bring daylight and connection over top of their dining room table. And in my house, I extended my stairwell an extra 5 feet so that I could bring daylight from the skylight that's on the top of the house all the way down the stairs to the front entrance. So I think my skylight is almost 30 feet from the floor below it to create that light. And really, in my case, I'm bringing it into 3 spaces. This is another project that was renovation. This was I guess a go up and go back. There's a rear extension as well as an attic conversion in this project. The skylights in question are on the side of the house, so they were specified at 60 degrees, so they could take advantage of the window or the setbacks. They didn't need the setbacks with the skylights because they were 60 degrees or below. And you can see that as you come up the stairs going to the 3rd floor, you've got that daylight washing the space. And you can see it from this angle. And then once you get up top, you might have noticed that it's a bit of a bridge. So you get the strong connection to both sides of the house. And there's a little balcony on the one side where there's vertical windows, and then the sloped glazing, the skylights on the other side. That creates this beautiful space, and it really is bringing light down through the entire core of this house. So it's extremely well daylit. Now, this is a project, I did grab this project out of the US to talk about because this was a garage renovation. This was in San Francisco. And this is a project where you don't see the skylights, but because they've left the floor or the ceiling joist in place, but that's created a nice pattern. And it's allowed them to reuse this garage space as living space. So sometimes expanding means repurposing a space in a home. And thinking of that, I'm actually standing just where the left side of that picture would be in that space that you're seeing there. That is my bedroom and sometimes home office. And this is a space, this was an unused attic. So in my case, our first big project in the house a few years ago was expanding up into the attic. And this is something we're seeing more again. It has to be an older home because you can't do this with trusses unless you remove the trusses, and that's a fairly big project. But as we see people buying these older homes and fixing them up, we're seeing a reemergence of people expanding into the attic space. And you can see the skylight on the left, that's the one that's open to 2 floors below. Now, going up doesn't always mean going into the attic. Sometimes going up just means pushing the ceiling up. So this image could have been part of the Go Big, but I wanted to include it here because it also speaks to that idea of making a space feel bigger. So expansion doesn't always mean increasing the floor space. Expansion can mean, like in the small spaces, simply bringing in more daylight so a space feels bigger. It changes the atmosphere of that space. All right, moving to number 4. This is a short one, talking about upgrades. Now, skylights went through a period of time where the one at the top was pretty common on residential applications. And Velux didn't sell that type of product, but they were very popular on houses for a couple of decades. And this lower performing, lower quality product actually made it really hard to sell skylights for a while because people kept thinking about this skylight that was too hot or too cold or had condensation or leaked. And they say, well, skylights, they're not great. The daylight was great, but I didn't like everything else. Well, it's just because they didn't have a good product. So we're seeing as people are re-roofing or investing in their homes, they are upgrading to higher performance product. And they're very satisfied. You know, even if it's not changing the size or changing anything on the interior, just going to a higher performance product can make a very big difference. Now, here's an extreme case. This is a project in Vancouver, a restoration project for skylights. I'm only showing one example of the skylights on this project, but this project was from the 1980s. It was an award-winning project, and there was a lot of effort and consideration in the Skylake Replacement of this project. And you can see the Vancouver skyline in the background. But this project was replacing this old skylight system with something that was going to be a lot more energy efficient. So that's a narrow corridor going through the center of the top of this condo. And just imagine how much sun you could have in there. And if I show, well, I don't have an image, it actually, why there's so much dirt on the old Skylight is that it had like lattice, like a plastic lattice laid on top of it when the project was initiated. And that was to reduce the solar heat gain from that old product. All right, the last section that we're going to talk about is Get Smart. So this is a project, and I really want to take my time through a couple of these slides because I think there's a lot of brilliance and creativity in some of these projects. So this project, it's doing a couple of things here. One, it's bringing daylight into the hallway, and the light shaft continues down to bring daylight into the ground floor of this space. So that's evident. You can also see that it's borrowing light, or the bedrooms adjacent to either side of the light shaft are borrowing light into those two spaces. And the windows have been offset for privacy, but you're essentially bringing daylight into 4 spaces from a single skylight. And this is really interesting because the most energy efficiency thing you can do with skylights is try to figure out how to use a smaller skylight. And we talk about this a lot in other webinars that we've done. How do you optimize the light and delivery, and do you flare things out? Do you use mirrors? In this case, they're doing a lot of borrowed light. So this is a really multifunctional skylight, and I love this because it really is checking off a lot of the boxes. It's creating the daylight. It's going to be more energy efficient because you don't have as many skylights. It's bringing light into multiple spaces. So this is a hardworking skylight, and I think a lot of smart design went into this. Very similar to that, this project had 2 bathrooms adjacent to the stairwell. So the skylight that's up above a stairwell is sharing light into 2 spaces. So you can see it's a little bit more apparent because you can see the glazing in this case. But you're bringing light in similar, just really smart to have that multifunctional skylight. I think I have one more project that's doing it just slightly differently. In this project, they've got 2 bathrooms that are adjacent to the stairwell. There's a nice size skylight over top of the stairwell, and they're using transom windows in the bathrooms to bring that daylight in. So again, we've got the stairwell bringing light to the upper floor and the center, or the lower floor through the core of the building, as well as this borrowed light going into the 2 washrooms. So this use of interior fenestration becomes interesting because you can share views and you can share daylight when you're designing with skylights, and you can make more connection through the space. And in this case, it's the image is from Russia, and it's a glazed space, so that's going to protect the sound part of it, but you still get that visual connection. And I just included, I know I talked a little bit longer than I intended to about the project earlier with the mirrors in the washroom, but mirrors can be very used in very clever ways to extend the space up to the skylight, but also deepen the skylight. The image on the right, you can see it doubles the size of the skylight. So it makes the space feel bigger because you get the reflection of the space, but more interesting for me is it's doubling the size of the skylight. So it's bringing in even more daylight because it's reflecting it. This is something that the design of the light shaft, the distance between the ceiling and the roof can have a huge influence on how much light you're bringing in from skylights. And I would say there's been a lot more interest, both from end users and architects talking about how to transition from the skylight to the light shaft to the ceiling, and whether it's a large flare, really almost exaggerated to the point where it's an entire 2nd story dedicated to the flare of the skylight in the center project, which is not far from my house. And then, as I mentioned, the project on the right earlier, where they've got that rounded transition to ease the contrast of the light between the skylight light shaft and the ceiling. It becomes really interesting. And this is something that at one point we saw occasionally in a well-designed project. We're starting to see the influence of the architects that are doing this type of work spill out into other projects. So we see this as a trend that's continuing to, expected to continue to be strong going into next year. All right, now the other one is forget smart is, of course, using smartphones. We have a system that you can use sensors. So I have this in my own house, and I have an app on my phone that I can open and close skylights by sliding a little toggle. But that whole setup also has a CO2 sensor, a humidity sensor, and a temperature sensor. And it can close the blinds behind me if the room is getting warm. If I'm presenting too long and the CO2 is getting high, it can actually open up the skylights to bring fresh air in. So it has a lot of functionality that's automatic. It's automated. That's one platform, but you can plug into several different systems. We've got the ability to hardwire into other control systems, other sensors, so that you can operate your skylights and blinds to try to optimize both the energy efficiency by controlling that solar heat gain in the summertime. So it's also the comfort part of it, but also give you that personal ability to override it. You know, if it's a really sunny day, sometimes I need to close the blinds behind me because I've got too much backlight if I'm presenting from this angle and I'm trying to frame the image behind me. So I think it's, you know, we're going to see more activity around automation. There's a lot of things we can do with glazing, and not all projects, you know, vertical windows, we might not see as much exterior awnings happening. But I think it's something that in Europe has gotten very big, and now we're starting to talk about it in North America again, because the exterior awnings do a couple of things for skylights. It can reduce the solar heat gain significantly because it's stopping the heat before it gets to the glass. It can also reduce the sound of rain. So I have a couple of skylights over my bed, so you know, it would be advantageous on a really hard rain night. I might not wake up from the sound of rain. But that can also be automated, so it only closes when there's a need for it to close. So this technology is emerging. It's here today, and we can buy all kinds of different CO2 sensors and that, but the connectivity to the devices in our house and getting closer to house as a system, you know, where your HVAC can talk to your skylights and figure out, hey, it's beautiful out. Let's not run the air conditioner. Let's open up the skylights and cool the house naturally. You know, we're getting close to that. So I think that's something to be watching for going into next year. Okay, that was the 5 trends and some discussion around where we see the influences coming in for residential skylights and the use in design and construction going into 2022. So hopefully we captured the learning outcomes. It's sometimes a challenge because these are determined prior to building the content at times. And with that, I say thank you to the RAIC. Thank you for allowing us to participate as a corporate affiliate member and for being able to present to you today.
Thank you. For more continuing education opportunities, please visit the RAIC website at raic.org/continuingeducation.